I am Scott Barrett, Associate Dean for External Affairs at the Maxwell School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's forum. Before we begin the conversation, certainly as we do for most of our events on campus, I would note that Maxwell recognizes with respect the Onondaga Nation, fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. Today is the latest in a series of conversations with Maxwell alumni and faculty members who are leading experts nationally and internationally on important topics of the day. We are recording this event and we'll post the recording on the Maxwell YouTube channel so that Maxwell alumni and friends who could not join us this afternoon can watch it as well. Later in the program, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. When we get to that portion of the program, please raise your virtual hand using the raise hand button at the bottom of the participant list, which can be accessed by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen. Leave your hand raised and we will call on you. And then you can unmute your microphone and ask your question. When you're not speaking, we ask that you keep your microphone on mute to lessen the noise for others. If you prefer to type your question, you may use the chat box, the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, and type your question there and I will ask your question for you. We are delighted to have Tina Nabatchi, professor in Maxwell's #1 ranked Public Administration and International Affairs Department, join us today. Professor Nabatchi is the Dr. Joseph A. Strasser Endowed Professor in Public Administration and a Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs. She is also a faculty research associate at the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration. We call it PARC in the Maxwell School. Her research focuses on citizenship participation, collaborative governance, conflict resolution, and challenges in public administration. Tina's research has been published in numerous journals, such as the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, Public Administration Review, American Review of Public Administration, National Civic Review, and Conflict Resolution Quarterly, among many others. She has several award-winning articles, including Addressing the Citizenship and Democratic Deficits, Exploring the Potential of Deliberative Democracy for Public Administration, which won the 2010 Best Article Award for the American Review of Public Administration. She's written Evaluating the Productivity of the Collaborative Governance Regimes, a Performance Matrix, which won the 2015 Best Article Award from Public Performance and Management Review. And The New Governance, Practices and Process for Stakeholders and Citizenship Participation in the Work of Government, which was recognized as one of the 75 most influential articles in the history of public administration review. In addition to numerous book chapters, monographs, and papers, Tina is also the lead editor of Democracy in Motion, Evaluating the Practice and Impact of Deliberative Civic Engagement. She has also recently published 2 books, Public Participation for 21st Century Democracy and Collaborative Governance Regimes. Last fall, Professor Nabatchi was named the 2019 recipient of the Leslie A. Whittington Excellence in Teaching Award by the Network of Schools of Public Policy, Affairs, and Administration, the national organization which recognizes faculty members who make outstanding contributions to public service, education, through excellence in teaching over a sustained period of time. There are many reasons why the Maxwell School is the #1 ranked school. 24 out of the last 25 years, the ranking has been done. Our outstanding faculty are certainly the main reason, and Professor Nabatchi is a great example of that. We are thrilled to have her here today, and I'll turn it over to her. Professor Nabatchi, please.
Wow, Scott, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I need to take you on the road with me. You make me sound much cooler and smarter than I actually am. You make me sound really nice and good. But now I'm going to turn around and give what might be a depressing talk for some. So let me see if I can share my screen and make my technology work here. When Scott asked me to give this talk, he said, Tina, pick something you feel strongly about and give a compelling talk that will engender conversation and questions. And what I heard Scott say was, Tina, be provocative. And as my colleagues will tell you, nobody has to ask me twice for that. So here goes. Let me start by giving you the premise of my talk today. I believe that we are at a watershed moment for democracy and thus for society and humanity. Less than 30 years ago, Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history and the ascendancy of Western liberal democracy as the final form of government. Today, I would argue, democracy faces myriad threats that have the potential not only to undermine the ascendancy of democracy, but also to subordinate democracy to what are, in my opinion, far worse forms of human government. So if we agree that democracy is the best political system yet devised, and that its existence is necessary to protect the liberties and dignity of humanity, then I would argue we need to start having some very difficult conversations. We need to begin defending democracy, and we need to begin doing that immediately. So today I'd like to talk about some of the threats to democracy and frame those threats within the context of democratic rollbacks and regime cleavages. Let me explain. A central concept in the study of democratic politics is the notion of cleavage structures, which refer to the basic axis of political conflict within a society. In some countries, these cleavages, these political conflicts, are about class or about race. Sometimes they're about geography, the urban-rural divide, and sometimes they're about religion. Such cleavages are undoubtedly challenging, but democracy can survive. It can even thrive with these cleavage structures as long as people respect the fundamental institutions of democracy. But regime cleavages are different. Regime cleavages occur when ordinary people across a society have political conflict about the very foundations of government, about the political system as a whole. And I think we are starting to see the first signs of regime cleavage in democracies all around the world. Citizens and politicians no longer just disagree about policy options or even about the nature of the policy problems themselves. Rather, they are beginning to disagree about the fundamental tenets of democracy. Today, I want to talk about 4 elements of democratic rollback and regime cleavages: attack on democratic values, institutions, and practices, abuses of human rights, repression through technology and surveillance, and deepening inequality. These 4 elements are not independent. They are related. They feed into one another and reinforce one another in a vicious cycle. And all of them, independently and in concert, serve to spread and deepen democratic rollbacks and regime cleavages. Before I move on, I feel compelled to note that the global COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed and extended these concerns. Questions of democracy, of human rights, of technology and surveillance, of inequality have certainly come to the fore during this pandemic. But I would like to respectfully set that aside for a moment and talk about each of these issues in turn. So first, attacks on democratic values, institutions, and practices. Almost everywhere we look, we see these attacks happening. But unlike in the past, these attacks are not just occurring in authoritarian nations. They are also increasingly prevalent in democracy. In the United States, our core values are being strained and the stability of our political system tested under the weight of President Trump, who shows little respect for democratic norms and principles. Of course, this is not just about Trump, and Trump is not solely to blame. We are simply seeing the ultimate expression of a path we have been on for a while. Nevertheless, President Trump assails and continues to assail essential democratic institutions, including the separation of powers, a free press, an independent judiciary, the impartial delivery of justice, safeguards against corruption, and perhaps most disturbingly, the legitimacy of elections. But the attacks on democratic institutions extend well beyond US borders, including in other parts of the Americas. From the brutal crackdowns on protesters under the authoritarian rule of President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and President Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, to the deeply marred elections that brought around right-wing populist Jair Bolsonaro to the presidency in Brazil and left-wing populist Andrés Manuel López Obrador to the presidency in Mexico, to the judicial disruptions that cleared the way for Evo Morales, head of the ruling movement towards socialism party in Bolivia, to run for a 4th term in 2019, and the election fraud that ultimately forced his resignation. The democratic progress we were once so sure of in the Americas now seems to be turning tide. Europe started 2019 with assorted populists and ethno-nationalists holding office in 11 European nations and scoring double-digit vote tallies in Finland, Sweden, Germany, the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Switzerland, Denmark, and the Netherlands. We have witnessed the rise of the National Front in France, the PIS party in Poland, the Golden Dawn in Greece, and the Fidesz party in Hungary. In 2017, the Alternative for Deutschland party became the first far-right party in Germany's national parliament in nearly 60 years, coming in third place overall in federal elections. And a few months ago, the German city of Dresden declared a Nazi emergency in light of growing violence. In the Asia-Pacific region, military influence and the persecution of minorities is on the rise. Simply look to Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Even India, the world's largest democracy, is experiencing fundamental threats to its democratic institutions under the reign of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In the Middle East and North Africa, the flickering lights of democracy are dimming further as political, economic, and social repression grows, while many countries in sub-Saharan Africa still struggle to deliver basic freedoms and protect human rights. This brings me to my second point. Humanitarian crises and flagrant human rights abuses run rampant around the world. Amnesty International's 2019 report identified the top 10 global hotspots, many of which we would expect. Venezuela, Yemen, Turkey, Syria, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and China, and many of which we would not expect. Australia, the United States, and the European Union. Australia had undertaken a program to indefinitely confine seaborne migrants in squalid camps. The United States pursued a policy separating migrant children from their detained parents. Italy, acting on behalf of the European Union, has been striking deals with Libyan militias to detain African migrants and prevent them from sailing to Europe. As a result, the modern slave trade is booming. These nations' punitive approaches to immigration not only violate human rights, but also serve to embolden and excuse more aggressive policies and actions elsewhere around the world. No wonder ethnic cleansing is a growing global trend. In 2019, Freedom House identified 11 countries, up from 3 in 2005, that were engaging in ethnic cleansing or other egregious efforts to alter the ethnic composition of their territory. In Syria, hundreds of thousands of civilians from certain ethnic and religious groups have been killed or displaced. Russia's occupation of Crimea has included the targeted repression of Tatars and those who insist on maintaining their Ukrainian identity. Myanmar's military has been committing genocide against the Rohingya people since the start of a violent crackdown in 2017. And Saudi Arabia's indiscriminate bombing campaign in Yemen, coupled with its use of blockade as a weapon of war that fuels famine and disease, amounts to nothing less than genocide. And China's mass internment of over 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Hui, and other Muslims in re-education camps, where reports of torture and death continue to grow, can only be interpreted as an attempt to annihilate the distinct identities of minority groups. Third, the challenges to democracy and human rights are being facilitated by the increasingly awesome power of technology and the rise of surveillance. 10 years ago, numerous scholars and activists, maybe even some in this virtual room, proclaimed technology to be the savior of democracy. They asserted that the age of the internet and its digital platforms would usher in the next form of democracy, increasing the people's voice and connection with their government and easing citizenship and democratic deficits. But those promises have not come to fruition. I would argue that at best, technology is a double-edged sword, and at worst, its democratic promises have become democratic perils. Let me give a few quick examples. The most obvious is social media, the platforms on which fake news and electoral interference have been rendered most strongly. These platforms allow, and even through their algorithms, encourage people to stay in their increasingly small bubbles, narrowing the scope of information, perspective, and views to which they are exposed. Algorithms are also behind critical government decisions. As amazing strides in artificial intelligence continue, we in government, and consequently in the public, are progressively ceding our control over our decision-making and our discretion to computers. Some argue that decisions by algorithm are more neutral and objective than decisions by humans, but that's bogus. Those algorithms are only as unbiased as the data that are input, and we know that our data in many fields, particularly in crime, policing, security, justice, education, healthcare, and human services, where the use of AI is growing fastest, are fundamentally biased. Another example, and one that gets far less attention, is that the majority of this technology and most of these tech platforms belong to the private sector, which is profiting greatly from their perfection, often for purposes unaligned with, even at odds with, democracy. Simply consider the collection and use of our data by corporations and governments, or the widespread, often without permission, use of facial recognition technology. And in fact, this recently happened to me on a flight last year in the United States. I opted out of the airline's optional facial recognition program, but it was used on me anyway. And I felt very uncomfortable about complaining for fear that I wouldn't be let on the plane or that I might be blacklisted somehow. To be clear, this was an American company operating in the United States of America. And I found that whole situation to be alarming and quite uncomfortable. And one of the reasons for that is that I have been thinking a lot about China's social credit system, which gives each citizen a trustworthiness score that determines where they can live, where their kids can go to school, and whether they can travel. In the words of that program's official blueprint, the social credit system will, quote, allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. In short, private sector tech platforms are aiding the steady implementation of the surveillance state, which we are all readily buying under the guise of convenience and connection. But in doing so, we risk ushering in a new era of digital authoritarianism. As the internet takes on the role of a virtual public sphere and the cost of surveillance technologies decline, we stand on the precipice of my 1984 dystopian nightmare, in which totalitarian models of digitally enabled social control pose a major risk to democracy worldwide. There cannot be democracy without dissent, and there cannot be dissent without anonymity. And if you think that this is hyperbole, then simply consider that China is fastidiously exporting its model of comprehensive internet censorship and surveillance around the world, offering trainings, seminars, and study trips, as well as advanced equipment that takes advantage of artificial intelligence and facial recognition technologies. This digital authoritarianism, which is being touted as an alternative path to modernity, is increasingly appealing to many nations around the world, many of whom feel left out of democracy's promised economic advances. And this brings me to my final point. These challenges of democracy, these abuses of human rights, these perils of technology, they all hinge on and simultaneously exemplify and exacerbate the problems of inequality. I could speak on this issue at length, but I am reminded of my time limits. So let it suffice to say that we have massive inequalities in our communities, our nations, and our world. Inequalities of income, of voice and opportunity, of access to food, water, and basic health care, of social, political, and environmental resources, of justice, of basic human rights. These inequalities are becoming deeper and wider, more systematic and more systemic, and more profound in every way imaginable. And yet, we're not really discussing them or working to address them in meaningful ways, despite the fact that these inequalities are fundamental, existential threats to democracy. Democracy must mean more than equality of suffrage, one person, one vote. It also must mean some level of equality in opportunity, access, and treatment. I could continue, but I hope that I've made my point adequately. Democratic rollbacks are spreading around the world and regime cleavage is on the rise. To be clear, this is not a left-right issue. It is not a Democrat-Republican or liberal-conservative issue. It is an issue of democracy versus authoritarianism. This is about the conscious rejection of democratic values, the intentional weakening of democratic rules, and the deliberate destabilization and dismantling of democratic institutions. But instead of the outright coups of the past, democracy now suffers more discreetly, though I think one could argue the attacks on democracy have become much more violent and visible over the last year. Leaders and the citizens in many democracies, including some in the United States, are increasingly willing to delegitimize political opponents and reduce their civil liberties, to intimidate or assert control over the opposition, the media, religious groups, the academia, the private sector, NGOs, and civil society leaders and activists, and to politicize security services and tolerate violence and particularly violence as a legitimate form of political speech. They are increasingly tolerant of racial and prejudicial animosity as an acceptable form of political argument, and increasingly contemptuous of the rule of law and systems of checks and balances. They are increasingly willing to accept the co-optation of the bureaucracy and the judiciary for political and personal ends, and increasingly unwilling to punish political malfeasances and self-dealing. Here's the rub of it all, my friends. We seem to be living in an era of dysfunction by design, characterized by the purposeful, ideologically driven hobbling and dismantling of democratic institutions. But at the same time, these democratic rollbacks, regime cleavages, and other governance functions are growing, humanity faces increasingly wicked public problems. We now confront serious political, social, and environmental challenges on a truly grand scale. And this demands new thinking about the role of governance, government, and citizens in building and maintaining and improving democracy. Again, I'm reminded of my time, but I don't want to end on a negative note. It's not really my style. I believe in aspirational thinking. We have to have an idealistic vision of our future if we are to know where we are going and whether we are heading in the right direction. So let me give you some good news. Humanity has a natural inclination for democracy. We can see this back to the earliest beginnings of civilization, long before Athens, and in geographies and cultures far away. We see evidence of processes and structures for participatory, deliberative, and democratic decision-making. Today, we can see humanity's democratic desires in the bravery of protesters and activists all around the world. As of June 4th, there were protests related to the Black Lives Matter movement across the United States, but also in the UK, New Zealand, Germany, France, Italy, Ireland, Poland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Israel, Sudan, Canada, South Africa, Brazil, and Australia. In the Philippines, protesters are sounding the alarm over a new anti-terror bill that some fear will suppress free speech. Protests in Hong Kong have reignited after Beijing set out to impose new national security legislation. In Brazil, people are protesting police brutality and weighing in on the ongoing investigations against President Bolsonaro. In Chile, citizens are protesting lockdowns and food shortages. And in the past year, we've seen pro-democracy protests and protests related to inequality, corruption, political freedom, climate change in several other countries, including Spain, Bolivia, Lebanon, Ecuador, Egypt, Austria, and Iran. I know I am missing many, many others. These demonstrations, which began as tiny sparks, have ignited wider protest movements, lifting the lid on deeper inequalities, frustrations, and lack of autonomy that go back decades. And this discontent doesn't appear to be subsiding anytime soon. Indeed, across the globe, activists are taking to the streets in highly organized, persistent movements to tell their leaders, this isn't good enough. We must do better. Yes, we must do better. We must realize that democracy is not an end state. It is a state of action. It means always working to clear the path of obstacles. It means continuing to strive for the ideals of freedom and justice. It means working consciously and concertedly, alone and with the many, as artists and scholars, politicians and activists, to leave our world more beautiful, more graceful, and more kind than it was left to us. And we need to do this now, because defending democracy is one of the great causes of our time. Thank you.
Tina, thank you. Thank you so much. I think you gave our guests a real glimpse into why you are one of the most popular faculty in the Maxwell School. So thank you for sharing that talk with us. Very provocative indeed. So at this point, we have the great opportunity to open it up for questions. So I would encourage anyone in the audience who has a question to raise your hand using the participant icon at the bottom of the screen. You can use the button to raise your hand. We'll call on you, or type your question in the chat box. Tina, I might start if you will, and I'm curious about how you might advise students or any of us, particularly in this country, about how we access news and information. Where are the go-tos? How do we sort good from bad, right from wrong, when the whole system at one time or another. People are editing photos and videos, and a lot of weird stuff going on right now. What do you see, and what do you say?
Absolutely. There have been a lot of studies out there, and you can do some quick internet searching to find lists of media sources that are more or less biased, more or less neutral. I guess I would recommend everyone to not get their news from social media, B, kind of fact check the information that's coming across social media, and C, to read widely. I think I try really hard. Well, I try to read widely. I try to read news and listen to news sources that are coming from multiple different places, because it's through understanding those perspectives, I think that we can have more understanding with one another and have better dialogue around these issues.
Great. Thank you. Some questions coming in on the chat. I'm going to jump around a little bit just as they line up. But Anthony Powell is asking, maybe associated, how can the role of the press be further protected as an instrument for democracy?
I love these questions. I have to be honest with everybody. I've spent so much time thinking about what the problems were that I didn't necessarily think about what the solutions were. And I recognize that that's kind of the next step that has to come. And so I would love to hear from others what they think some of the solutions here are. When we talk about protecting the press, I think number one is being aware of what's going on and understanding the kind of co-optation that has happened in our media and the narratives that are being constructed around reliable media sources. So I think paying attention is step number one. Step number two, I would turn to our schools, great schools like the Newhouse School at Syracuse University, other schools of communication, and really begin conversations about how we can protect journalists and journalism and press freedom as we move forward into the future.
Great. Thank you, Tina. Also, maybe tangential to this, but Carlos is asking, are there any helpful resources we can use to explain to the older generations about the negative effects that technology is having or can have on our democracy?
I think the challenge of talking about technology is that it is such a double-edged sword. My mom is sitting here today watching this talk. I'm sure she'll have a lot to say to me after. But my mom is on here because of technology. And so I think we have to be honest about what the promises of technology are, but also what the limitations of them are. The best things to do, I think, are just to have honest conversations about this. There's been a lot of work. The IBM Center has done some work around artificial intelligence. There are reports that have come out of how we can think about artificial intelligence and surveillance. There are lots of studies about social media and its kind of undue influence on people and how it really narrows people's perspectives. So I think a first thing to do is inform yourself and then just try to have conversations.
Great. Thanks. Kathy Dakoff from the Maxwell Advisory Board asks the big question, which is, what can citizens do? What is the call? What can citizens do to?
Yeah. So this is Kathy. That's like, I told Scott to only ask me softball questions. So far, none of them have been softballs. And I would say again that I've really been thinking a lot about this, especially in light of kind of recent current events. My go-to answer used to be, let's have dialogue and deliberation. We can create structures and processes to listen to people who have different views on these issues. And we can, if we use those processes, we can have effective and constructive conversations. I think that those processes are still really useful, but they're necessary, but they're insufficient. I'm really challenged by these kinds of cleavage structures that we're seeing in society. I do think we need to change a little bit of the way that we think about conflict. So I see my colleague Lou Kreisberg is on the call, and Lou's done a tremendous amount of work around constructive conflict. We as Americans, and I think in many other places around the world, many other cultures, we kind of have this tendency to think negatively about conflict. And I actually think that we have a huge opportunity right now to stand up boldly in face of the conflict that we're having, and to say we can use this as an opportunity to learn from one another and to transform this into productive and constructive conflict. And I would actually love to hear Lou's thoughts on how we might address some of this. Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, Lou, there, but I mean, really, he is the guru of constructive conflict. So I think instead of shying away from this, I think we have to stand up boldly. I think we have to acknowledge it face on. And I think we have to learn and figure out new ways of addressing some of these conflict issues.
Lou, I don't know if you are available, if you want to speak to anything that Tina just tossed your way. Lou, if you would like to speak, please do.
Okay, audible?
We can both see you and hear you. Yes, Lou.
Okay. Well, Tina, that was magnificent. I mean, you laid it out. I couldn't disagree with any of the depiction of the reality we face. I'm glad, though, you did move on to say, well, what do we do about it? And I think we do fight constructively. That means taking into account the other people's interests, but try to recognize what is really in our common interest. Everybody would be better off. Everybody would be better off if there was more equality.
Yeah.
I all pay a heavy price for the inequality, and the pandemic documents that. So I would say, for everything you said about what we can do, we do it collectively. We find colleagues, we find friends, we find people in other camps to join. What's going on right now is fantastic with the Black Lives Matter, that it has been so diverse and everybody seems so touched with it.
Thank you, Lou. We're getting a ton of questions, Tina, so we're going to really put you to work here. Let's see. Sorry, I've lost a little bit of track here, but here we go. You rightfully point out that defending democracy should not be a partisan issue. How do we ensure that we don't allow partisan issues to get in the way of defending democratic values, especially when the partisan divide has arguably never been deeper?
Yeah, I think that's great. It's a really great question, and it's a really difficult question. So often the conversations that we have with people about our political issues stay on the surface of matters, right? It's immigration is a problem. No, immigration is not a problem. Or police brutality is a problem. No, it's not. It's two sides of an issue. I think we really need to train ourselves to do some deeper listening. As Lou was suggesting, we need to start understanding people's interests, not their positions. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are what's motivating those. And if we can start to listen a little bit deeper to those underlying issues, I guarantee you that we find more common ground than difference. And I have found this, although I find social media platforms to be incredibly challenging, I try to have some of those dialogues on those platforms, better yet, off of those platforms with people with really, really different views. And while we don't necessarily come to agreement, we do come about what should be done. We do come to some agreement around some core values that we hold as not just Americans, but as people who believe in democracy. And I think once we find those core values, once we find those things that tie us together, it's easier to imagine solutions to a number of the policy challenges we're having. So I would say stay away from those partisan wedge issues and really think more deeply about what brings us together as Democrats, small d Democrats, not Democrat Republicans, small d Democrats, and kind of citizens who want to see the world be a better place.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Do you think America's expansionary liberal order abroad, which may not be too liberal, positively impacts the erosion of democratic institutions at home? For example, the militarization of law enforcement in the US could be attributed to the ever-growing military activities abroad.
Abdul Aziz, that is not a softball question. Abdul was one of my former students. You know, I think that question is really, really tough because it's a loaded question. No matter how I answer it, somebody's going to get angry. I do think that we need to rethink militarization both abroad and at home. I think we We can't just go at the world as if it were a hammer. I think we need to be far more inviting and open and try to bring people into the liberal democratic order. I think that the more encompassing we are, the more we're going to promote those values abroad. I think that some of the militarization does erode those kind of democratic institutions, and it does so in a number of ways, from literally undermining values to redirecting budgets and monies to causes that don't necessarily support the values I think most people would agree are important for democracy.
Great. More questions. Fran is asking, what about those in government who are intentionally destroying our federal agencies internally, weakening the ability for government to function for our citizens?
Yeah, this is one of my huge concerns. As a public administration scholar and as a person, one of the 4 people on earth that say they will love bureaucracy, I really truly believe that civilization does not exist without our agencies and without our institutions of government. And I have real concerns about what happens to the resiliency of those organizations when they keep getting chipped away at, when the foundation can only become so weak before the whole house topples down. What about those? I would say find the candidates that you really love, campaign and work for them, and vote the rest out, right? We have the power to make some of those changes in government.
Absolutely.
And also, let's stop bureaucracy bashing. Can I just say that for a second? Everybody complains about bureaucracy and the inefficiencies in these slow, lumbering, behemoth organizations and all the red tape. But those bureaucracies do a tremendous amount of good. And so let's not accept that narrative that bureaucracy is bad. Let's really start thinking about how we can make the administration of our bureaucracies better, but understanding that we need bureaucracy to function as a civilization and a society. I'm pro-bureaucrat.
I would have been shocked if that didn't come out during this session, Tina. So thank you. I would have gone there if you didn't. So thanks. Lynn is asking, what do you think about the ineffectiveness of international pressure on nations that currently conduct ethnic cleansing, such as China, with their continual operation of re-education camps for Muslim people? Does this show how authoritarian regimes can undermine the power of democracy greatly?
I think, yes, it absolutely shows how authoritarian regimes can undermine democracy. But I would throw my question back to Lynn and say, do you really think there's been international pressure? Because I haven't seen it. We'll occasionally see a report, we'll occasionally see something on the news, but we are not seeing sustained systemic pressure against China for the internment camps that it has, against Myanmar, for the Rohingya people, against Saudi Arabia, and for its indiscriminate bombing in Yemen. We are not seeing those kinds of intent, consistent international forms of pressure. And so I think we need to be working to make these challenges more visible and to be encouraging our governments to say more and step up against them.
Another question we have: democracies and liberal thinking tend to emphasize a marketplace of ideas model, a model in which discourse is prized. However, it often feels like illiberal democratic figures do not value this type of discourse in the same way, but are happy to exploit our aspiration to debate and discuss every idea in good faith and to promote an obviously dangerous illiberal agenda. Tom Cotton's New York Times opinion piece comes to mind. How do we combat this? How do we deal?
Again, these are they're really big questions, and I love that everybody's asking them because they're really forcing me to take these ideas and take them to the next step to think about what the solutions are. I recognize that it's not enough to just lay out the problems, although I do think that that's a first step. We have to articulate what's happening so that we can figure out and devise solutions to this. I didn't read Tom Cotton's opinion piece. I'll have to search for that and look that up. I do think illiberal democratic figures, these illiberal Democrats, of course they want to exploit those kinds of that discourse that happens in democracies. Of course they do. That works to their benefit and favor. I think what we need to start thinking about is how do we start making that discourse work for us again? I mean, when I think about the deliberative functions of our government, whether that's at the federal level in Congress or even at a local school board, hyper-local school board level, those deliberative functions of our decision-making bodies seem to have flown out the window. I listened in on a school board meeting from my hometown the other day, and I was floored at how people spoke across one another, how they couldn't listen to one another, and how everything seemed to be really driven by this zero-sum game approach to things. I really feel like we need to kind of we need a return of civility, but also a return to being able to have constructive dialogue, of listening to one another and trying to listen more deeply and attentively to what people are saying.
So Tina, you definitely succeeded in your provocative talk. The chat box is blowing up here. We've got all kinds of comments and questions, but I'm just jumping back. Darren Hernandez, I see here, has commented. It jumps back to one of your comment about bureaucracy, I think, and Darren, who is in state management out in California. Darren writes, bingo, one way to strengthen our democracy is by improving the management and efficiency of our bureaucratic institutions. The social democracies of Europe are much more effectively managing the pandemic than our American government system. So that's Darren's point. A whole range of great questions coming in. But to jump back to, I thought there was an important call back to one of your other questions, which, why do you think there hasn't been unified, sustained international pressure against nations like China, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, that are committing these mass human rights atrocities?
You know, like, so now I'm more, you know, there is an order to things that can be upset if we really challenge those, right? If we think about, and I'm not trying to be conspiratorial here or to whatever, but if we challenge China, we upset trade balances, right? We upset kind of economic orders around things. If we challenge Saudi Arabia, we risk energy challenges here in the United States. If we kind of push back on all of these things, then you know, it's like sending off potential dominoes. There's a lot to this, to the kind of order of things, which is why, you know, one of my points here, and it's so hard for me to articulate, so please bear with me, but this is not just an issue of the United States. These are issues of kind of the world, of humanity. I really believe that we are at a turning point, particularly when we think about the scale of challenges we have facing us. And it becomes, quite honestly, really difficult to talk about these things because of the backlash one might get, right? And so I think one of our very first steps is to acknowledge the problem and then create a space where we can really talk about these things.
Another question, Tina, do you have thoughts, questions, concerns about free and fair elections in this country relative to 2016, Russia, China, et cetera? What are your thoughts there? And what do we need to be thinking about going forward for our elections, for us to have confidence in our elections?
Yeah, I do have real questions about that. I think we are seeing, I mean, you can just read the news. There's all sorts of instances and challenges around voter suppression, around electronic balloting systems not working, around voting by mail. I have real concerns about those systems. We need major reform, not just at the national level, but at state by state level and by precinct level. We know that balloting and kind of election systems and polling places work better in wealthier white communities than they do in poor minority communities where people of color live. I mean, there's empirical evidence showing all of these things. And every American and every Democrat, small d Democrat, should be angry about these things and should be raising attention to them.
Good. Javier from the Maxwell Advisory Board, I'm sure emailing us from where he lives and works in Spain, is asking, how could collaborative governance help strengthen democracy and overcome the regime cleavages that you talk about?
That's a really great question. So one of the things that I study, and one of the one of the ways that I think we can really improve the functioning of our government is by helping our public servants and by helping our public agencies learn how to work across boundaries, whether those boundaries are governmental, federal, state, local, international, whether they're organizational within the same level of government, sectoral, public, private, nonprofit sector, or even kind of jurisdictional. When those organizations are able to work, I mean, our public most of our real challenging public problems, they don't respect boundaries. It's not like climate change says, oh, Syracuse, I'm not going to affect you. I'm going to get all of the rest of central New York, but Syracuse, you're safe, right? And so when we enable our public servants, when we create structures and processes that allow them to work across boundaries, to work with one another, they can create more durable solutions that are better informed by information, that bring people together with different understandings about things, that are creating multi-pronged approaches to addressing multi-pronged problems, rather than the kind of single dart that government agencies, because of their hierarchical structures, like to throw. And so I think that collaborative governance can go a long way towards solving our problems. And frankly, if we can do better around solving problems, if we can do better getting people access to healthcare, economic development in our communities, housing in our communities, then people are going to be much more willing and able to buy into the broader political system. When your government doesn't provide you with those goods and services, there's no reason for you to support it. Right? And so to the extent that we can use government to improve performance and outcomes and results on the ground for its citizens in the United States and abroad, the more likely we are to see the prosperity, not just of democracy, but of society as a whole.
Great, Tina. Thanks. John is asking, are there other good examples of successful multi-ethnic democracies that have survived? For democracy to survive here at home, but also in many other countries, a system and a structure designed for white dominance is going to have to share power with minority groups. Can we learn something from those other examples? Do our structures need to change in order to incorporate more voices?
Yeah, so we have seen some examples of consociational democracies that have worked really well to create kinds of power sharing and autonomous arrangements among multiple ethnic groups that were in conflict with one another. But John, I think your question here is really going to be, it's really a pressing question. We know that the kind of democratic socialist governments of Northern Europe have been really successful at delivering public services. But we also know that those populations had, until fairly recently, been relatively homogenous. And as we see immigration happening, as we see people move around the world for a variety of reasons, and by the way, I think we're going to see a lot more movement in the coming decades because of climate change. We're going to see massive shifts of human population, human migration. The real question is whether those systems will survive and how they will function. And I really don't know the answer to that. And we see, some of the election results that I talked about in Europe right now, some of that backlash is because of the migration, because of minority groups moving in. It's going to be a real challenge.
Thanks. Victoria asked a couple of questions, but in particular, one that caught my eye, it connects to one of your points earlier, Tina, but could technology help us create new democratic infrastructure to address some of these problems? So can technology be the solution and not the problem?
I think technology could be a solution to some of these things, but that we need to have real conversations about how to use them. So I think technology absolutely could help with things like our voting systems, right? I mean, we could do online voting. There are safeguards that could be set up. Blockchain technology, I think, offers huge potential advantages for democracy, but really I'm a techno moron. I had to talk to our ICT people about how to show the PowerPoint and have a Word document up. So I just want to be honest about where I am on the technology front. So I think that there's huge potential for democracy to help, but for the technology to be useful and to be most constructive, we have to put in some real safeguards around privacy, around how data are used and by whom. We have to think about the use of big data. I mean, I don't know how many of you are on social media, but I swear you search for something on your phone and the next day you're on Facebook and there are all sorts of ads coming up for it. We really need to think about the kind of infrastructure of data sharing that we're having and what that means for individual citizens. And a second issue is that we need to do this in ways that average citizens can understand and interpret. So whenever you download an app to your phone, we have to accept the privacy agreement. Nobody I know reads those. I don't read those. They're like 30 flicks of my finger on a phone and in language that I can't understand. And not to sound pretentious or elitist here, but I have a PhD. And if I don't understand that, then how do other people understand that? So yes, there's huge potential for technology, but we have to build in some safeguards, some usable safeguards to help it reach that potential.
A very important question in the current environment. Max is asking, in the struggle to curtail the spread of COVID, some democracies gave their intelligence agencies the authority to monitor their own citizens as part of their contact tracking efforts. Do you think it's a necessary evil in the time of national crises, or it's a slippery slope to justifying other non-democratic means to consolidate power by the government in the future?
Can it be both? Can I say yes and?
I think you can.
I can follow the rule of improv. Yes and. I mean, I do think, in this pandemic time, we are incredibly lucky that there are tools available to help us with contact tracing. I mean, that is just, it's an incredible weapon that we can use to fight the spread of disease and help prevent the death of, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. And so, yes, I think there's some use to that. But again, unless we have the privacy safeguards in, unless we have those conditions under which government and others can use those technologies, I think there are real problems. So I know that people were using cell phones to see how far people were going from their home. I know a lot of people just have their names up, but did anybody ever give permission for that? Did you know that that was happening until you read it in the media? And so while that is potentially a hugely useful tool, I think it is also a slippery slope. I think, there were uses of drones in China that would fly around and shriek at people, so to send them back into social isolation. So yes, useful tool and slippery slope.
Great. We probably have time for one or two more. We're getting close to the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of time. Let me just scan the chat box here. I think you answered this earlier about the downstream associated or unintended consequences, Tina. But Carlos is asking, do you believe it would be beneficial for the United States to pressure countries into reforming their governments into a more democratic system, or would the United States acting as, quote, the world police backfire and weaken democratic efforts in other countries?
I think we need carrots and sticks. We need carrots and sticks for all of this. Simply using sticks, simply using means of embargoes, of embargoes, of not letting flows in goods into services, those things only affect people on the ground. And that creates and breeds resentment and hostilities towards the United States. But of course, we can't just say, hey, welcome, come into the house and do whatever you want, right? We have to, so there's a balance to be struck there. I do think we need to be more, so I think of the case of Iran, for example, we have tremendous boycotts. People on the ground are suffering around medication, of humanitarian aid. And there's got to be some way to and I'm not an international relations scholar, but there's got to be some way to support the people who want to see change, but also pressuring government into reform. There's got to be a balance that's struck there. If you just beat people with a stick, they're going to get angry and bite back. And if you just feed them carrots, they're going to not change because they're getting the reward all the time. That's not very well articulated, but hopefully you get the point.
Tina, you're great. I think again, to be respectful of time, we're 5 of the hour. You've given us exactly what we had asked for, and we thank you so much. It was a great session for us today.
Thanks, Scott.
Again,
Can I
we've
say
recorded.
one
Oh,
last
please.
thing? Because
Please,
I realize
absolutely.
that a lot of people might disagree with a lot of what I've said, and that's okay. I actually welcome that kind of disagreement and conversation. But I do think that if we really care about the future of the US, the future of humanity, the future of the world, then conversation is the best starting point. And so I would welcome people who disagree, who agree, to reach out. I'd love to hear those opinions, and I'd love to hear from others about what you think the solutions are, because that's the next step of how we move forward, is to really start thinking about solving problems.
And
so thank you. Thanks for your time today, everyone.
absolutely. Tina, thanks. And, as we continue these sessions, a couple of weeks ago, Bob McClure did a session, and he was going to do a follow-up session about the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, and can we talk together? But in light of more recent events, Bob is going to talk next Wednesday, Wednesday the 24th, 3 p.m. on the same channel, if you will, about change in America and how do we make change in America, and that it's hard, sort of hard boring through hard, or slow boring through hard boards is what he's described it as. So we'll talk some more with Bob next week on the 24th, and we certainly hope folks will join us. Once again, we thank Jessica Murray, Matt Coulter, and our amazing ICT team, our amazing alumni relations team here at Maxwell. To our guests, if you have further questions for Dr. Nabatchi or suggestions for future topics, I'd encourage you to get in touch with me or to get in touch with our Alumni Affairs Department. You can get me at sabarr02@syr.edu. We look forward to engaging with you on these and other opportunities in the weeks and months ahead. Tina, thanks again. Thanks to our guests, and everyone, please be well and be safe. Take care.